So if you are even a little bit aware of like online mental health and personal relationship discourse, you've probably heard about narcissism, and you've probably seen two things. On one hand, you have the people who basically think narcissism is anything bad or selfish, and they will use it in that way. And on the other hand, you have the people who say, no, 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 you can't do that. Narcissism is literally only narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, as diagnosed by a professional. If you are not a professional capable of diagnosing NPD in a person you know, you cannot be talking about narcissism, or unless it's someone in your family who is diagnosed clinically with NPD. And I think both of these takes are wrong. I think the first take is sort of this is just human nature. When you have terms that are useful, but in a strongly positive or strongly negative way, or they have a strongly positive, strongly negative connotation, which it tends to make people just start using them more generically negatively or more generically positively. And that is, it's annoying, but that's human nature. But the other thing I think is worse because it's a very modern take. The idea of narcissism predates the diagnosis of NPD. It's named after narcissism, but it does not encompass narcissism as the concept would have been understood by English speakers through history. And so I've been thinking about this in terms of, so I read a book by Christopher Lasch, who is best known for his book, The Culture of Narcissism, which I actually don't have because it is one of his two books that are still in print. So until I'm ready to read it, I haven't ordered it. But this one I wanted to read and it was out of print, so I had to get it. Anyways, this book, he introduces the idea of narcissism as he defines it, which he's saying, okay, well, what is the myth of Narcissus? And so the original myth of Narcissus is this very vain dude, and he just loves looking at his reflection in the water. And Aphrodite, I think it is, falls in love with him, and he just pays no attention to her, the goddess of love, because he is so in love with himself. And so she turns him into the Narcissus flower. And so Lasch, he's looking at the story, and he says, well, basically, narcissism is having your self-image tied up in your reflection. And he has a more detailed description of what it is, which I might try to find in this book, and I'm also going to, at some point, read Culture of Narcissism, and I will talk about how he defines it. But I'm like, okay, yeah, based on the description, I get what he's talking about, and it is basically, so when people have a weak sense of identity in terms of what they are, like, except in terms of, is it good, like, socially? And so, and you meet people like this, and most people have at least some domains where we are like this, at least some of the time, but you meet people where this is like the predominant way they operate, is they are concerned with the idea, I'm a good person, I want to be a good person. And study after study in psychology shows, so I'm almost certain this will survive the replication crisis, just because there's so many studies that have shown this from so many angles. If you let people identify as a good person or do things that they think are good, then they are going to act in ways less consistent with being good either. Good is not something you are as a state, it is something you do. And the people who have this fixed view of themselves as good people, like, I always say, like, the worst people I meet are the people who are convinced they are good people. And the second worst people I meet are people who are convinced they are bad people, but they are a distant runner-up. And both of those, there's sort of this attitude, I can't change it. And I'm oversimplifying because you have, like, people who will think they're good in some aspects, bad in others, and they're fixed. But the issue is having this fixed view of this is who I am, as opposed to these are the things I'm doing, these are the things I want to be doing. And so, again, all of us fall into this trap at least some of the time in some contexts, but there is a type of person who falls into this most of the time in most contexts, who probably would not meet the clinical definition of narcissistic personality disorder, but it's still a useful definition. And so I've been thinking about this in terms of, so I read The Picture of Dorian Gray a while ago, sometime middle of last year, and then there's this online book club I attend, which is, they were reading it, and so they read it like 2-3 months after I read this book, and also after I had just read this book. And so my first reaction to reading Picture of Dorian Gray was mostly focused on Oscar Wilde really thinks of himself as a funny person and is constantly trying to be witty, and it grates on me and makes this book kind of hard to read. Like, if you've seen The Importance of Being Earnest, that works as a play. And I don't know if he does more of it in here. I think probably he doesn't, but it's just that kind of constant witty banter works better as a play than actually reading a book like this. So I found it tedious, but I found the ideas in the book interesting. And then I sort of didn't think about it until I went to this book club, which was just after I had read this book. And then, so they were teaching me about, or they were talking about the aesthetic movement, which I didn't know. And this is apparently the only thing anyone remembers from the aesthetic movement. But the interesting thing to me is, as we were talking about Dorian Gray, and he is sort of obsessed with his reflection, which is not literally, but his picture, which is, metaphorically his reflection. This painting, which has taken on his soul, and the things that he does that are making his soul ugly, he still remains beautiful, but he still becomes more and more put off by how he looks, how his picture looks. And I won't spoil the ending, although the ending doesn't really matter. It's the thought experiment here. And so I find this interesting because, again, NPD is something that I don't know when it got into the DSM, but it was sometime middle of the 20th century. But we've had the idea of narcissism and the concept for a while. And the way that that Dorian Gray is presented in the picture of Dorian Gray is very much sort of in line as a metaphor with how Christopher Lasch defines narcissism. And so I wanted to talk about that because I find that interesting, and also I get annoyed with people who say, no, narcissism is only clinical NPD and you can't use the term. Narcissism is a behavior sometimes, but it's also a sort of pattern of how you think about yourself in relation to your world. And if you're constantly thinking about yourself in terms of, is this making me being something with good qualities, and is this reflecting that, then that is narcissistic thinking. And you probably met people who are, especially if if you come from a developed country in the modern era, you probably met people like this. So I found that interesting, and I wanted to talk about this quickly. And again, at some point I'm going to get Culture of Narcissism and read that one too. And Lasch is a really interesting thinker, and he has several books I actually would like to talk about in the future. But I wanted to talk about this one now because that was an interesting connection for me. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I will see y'all in the next one.